I think I met many of you this morning. I'm Larry Diamond. I'm a senior fellow here, and I'm the principal investigator in the Global Digital Policy Incubator. My co-leader, I want to say again, Eileen Donahoe, our former U.S. ambassador to the Human Rights Council, is at a Board of Trustees meeting at Dartmouth today, so she regrets that she couldn't be here. I'll just say a little bit about the Global Digital Policy Incubator, which has been based for the last 2 years at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. We're really thrilled to be joining in this new cyber center with our programmatic colleagues that most of whom you've heard from in the last 2 hours, and the fourth of which you will hear from in the next hour. GDPI, as we call it by acronym, is really kind of a convening ground for wrestling with the multiple issues, some of which we began to talk about this morning, of how human rights and the quest to preserve free expression and civic space is colliding, in digital space with many of the problems that we are seeing in the internet in terms of the quest by governments for control, the quest by a variety of malign actors, governmental and non-governmental, to kind of poison the atmosphere and manipulate the ecosystem for undemocratic and really, sometimes very disturbing and even violent ends. And to think about how we can bring together a wide variety of stakeholders to try and find some common ground that can be incorporated into government policies, into the internal policies and practices of the internet platforms, into the way that civil society actors approach their work and make themselves more resilient and kind of more empowered to be voices in this sphere. And you're going to hear in the next 55 minutes or so a dialogue that's going to engage one, I think, of the most interesting issues we've been wrestling with, which is, how we can develop possibly a new multi-stakeholder tool or concept for moderating content. I'll speak a little bit more about that. But we've been holding a series of conferences and meetings, including what I think will be an annual conference now, trying to wrestle with the relationship between human rights and the remarkable leaping forward of artificial intelligence technology. We've been looking at the impact, as I've already suggested, of private sector actors and technologies on all of these issues and processes relating to human rights and free expression. And we're looking forward to working with the Digital Civil Society Lab here on the Stanford campus and a great NGO based in Washington, the International Center for Nonprofit Law, as well as the Honda Center here on Human Rights, to organize a digital boot camp that will bring together about 25 to 30 civil society actors from around the world who do not specialize in digital issues to become highly familiar with these issues so they can better speak up as advocates for free expression and civil society interests in the debates in their own country on government policy and corporate practices, and so they can become more resilient and aware in the use of these technologies. So let me begin with the substantive dilemma that I'll use to frame the conference. I think it's well familiar to most of you now, and then I'll introduce our panelists and begin the conversation with them. Obviously, we want to protect freedom of expression in the digital sphere as a basic human right, and at a time where I indicated this morning, it's increasingly being infringed upon. We don't want to legitimate, this is very important, the growing efforts, as I indicated this morning, of not only authoritarian states, but even many democratic ones to constrain, intimidate, and suppress free speech beyond the minimum that is necessary for a decent and nonviolent society. At the same time, we know these platforms are transmitting a lot of content that is blatantly and even violently harmful to society. And that includes extreme ethnic, gender, and religious prejudice, other forms of hatred of minorities and marginalized groups, incitements to and glorifications of physical violence, recruitment of terrorists, and all of the intentional fabrication and manufacture and spread of information that we've been talking about. So where do you draw the line? How do you draw the line? What are the rules you use? Obviously, the social media companies have rules and algorithms for removing the most obvious and egregious content, but they are wrestling with a very tough issue of where you draw the line in terms of content removal. They feel compelled to comply with national laws in the nations they're operating in, but there is a global public square, and should there be global rules, how far should they go in conceding to national or other different cultural norms? Who decides what is acceptable speech? What violates whose community standards? And a question Frank raised in a different context, can these internet titans so large and seemingly unaccountable really be trusted to make these decisions themselves? Now, even Facebook, in the face of these questions and pressures, has said, well, okay, we're going to create our own advisory council, someone referred to it as an internal Supreme Court, to help it make these tough decisions and maybe set certain decisions that could filter back into its algorithms and human content moderation. So there is then this model out there. It's got different ways of being conceptualized and applied called social media councils. Should these be global or specific to a geographic region, such as a country? Should they be industry-wide, or is it better to go with specific councils for specific companies like Facebook is planning to do? If it's the former, global, how do we define, industry-wide, how do we define the industry? If it's corporate, how does the advisory body acquire the autonomy to make decisions that may advance the public good, even if they're going to hurt the corporate bottom line? And of course, what should be the standards that these councils apply to questionable content? So on February 1 and 2, we had, I think, a great multi-stakeholder gathering here on campus in partnership with Article 19 and the UN Special Rapporteur on Promotion and Protection of Freedom of Expression, David Kaye, which gathered together specialists from civil society, academia, the social media platforms, the public policy world, to consider, debate, and brainstorm on these issues. Megan was there, Chinmayi was there. I don't know if you were there, Kit, but we did have one of your colleagues from EFF there. So I think many of you collected our report, which distilled a lot of what we learned from the Social Media Council, but we've now got 3 people who are going to help us think this through. And I'll introduce them in the order in which they approach me. So Chinmayi Arun is a fellow of the Berkman Klein Center of Internet and Society at Harvard University. She has served on the faculties of 2 of the most highly regarded law schools in India since 2010, and was the founder-director of the Center for Communication Governance at National Law University in Delhi. She's a member of the United Nations Global Pulse Data Privacy Advisory Group and of UNESCO India's Media Freedom Advisory Group. She's been a consultant to the Law Commission of India and a member of the Indian government's multi-stakeholder advisory group on for the India Internet Governance Forum. Next is my colleague, our Associate Director for Research at GDPI, who was the lead author of our conference report that many of you have on social media councils. Before coming to Stanford, Megan completed a PhD in politics at NYU as a member of the Social Media and Political Participation Lab that Josh Tucker leads, and was a postdoctoral scholar in Russian studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research examines how technologies affect the way individuals and states use and have access to information, and how all this shapes political behavior. She's looked at the Gezi Park protests in Turkey, the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine, the Russian states, malign, if I may say so, information strategies. And then finally, we have Kit Walsh, who is a senior staff attorney at one of my favorite civil society and advocacy groups in this space, the Electronic Freedom Foundation, working on free speech, net neutrality, copyright, coders' rights, and other issues that relate to freedom of expression and access to knowledge. Kit has worked for years to support the rights of political protesters, journalists, remix artists, and technologists to agitate for social change and to express themselves through their stories, their ideas, their various forms of expression. She previously led the civil liberties and patent practice areas at the Cyber Law Clinic, which is part of Harvard's Berkman Center. And Kit holds a JD from the Harvard Law School and a BS in neuroscience from MIT. I would tell you what she was doing in that undergraduate work, but I don't even fully understand it, so we'll move on. It's very, very sophisticated. All right, so I want to begin, Chinmay, if I may, we'll begin with you, and ask you each to help us drill down into the functions that social media councils might perform. We mention in our report, a kind of division between a kind of judicial adjudicatory function and an advisory function of kind of more policy setting, possibly hybrid model. And so you can break that down. One concept is these are really appeals bodies for the tough cases. Another is, they're going to set a baseline set of standards for governance of online platforms, and then maybe the platforms would commit to those standards, maybe governments would as well. A third is they just provide advice on the internal policy of the corporations, and then it's up to the platforms to decide what to do with them. And then the fourth is just kind of setting precedent by looking at tough cases that might be emblematic for the future. So what do you think the role might be or should be of these social media councils?
I'm going to be greedy and say all of the above.
Okay.
I don't think that they're contradictory. So one of the reasons that I absolutely enjoy this idea of the social media councils is because it's a concrete framework for baseline human rights law standard setting. And I think that that's something that we've been leaving behind in these conversations with the platforms. The conversations have become so siloed to platforms and to countries that it's fantastic that there's a project here that is saying that no, there are a series of human rights norms that we agreed on, and so let's talk about making our decisions somewhat consistent with them. So I think that from that point of view, the baseline standard setting is important. And then the methods that you outlined, to my mind, would actually make sense almost as a spectrum. So in the ideal case, it would be nice to have a body to which appeals can go that says that no, this country or this company or the two in combination got this wrong if you compare this to human rights standards. But I think that the challenge in doing that, say next year, is that it would be a very radical step for the countries and the companies, and they're not used to it. And so if I were looking at the models that you outlined, what I might be interested in is how can we progress to the appeals mechanism, because what we want is something concrete and something that actually has impact, but the route to it might be more gradual. We might have to start with an advisory role, with building a body of case law to show the world that there is such a thing as a consistent standard that can be tailored locally. I'll stop here.
Okay, so you have a principled but pragmatic approach. Megan.
So I've made the same mistake again as earlier.
But fortunately, you have a
Now I know.
hearty voice.
I do. So I think that in principle I agree with Chinmayi, which is to say that I think that all of these have value, but I guess that I view the advisory and the global standards components as, and maybe this is more or less what you're saying, which is I view those as sort of the foundation on which anything else has to be built. So if we're going to have a multi-stakeholder body, and if it's going to be, particularly if it's going to be global, I think one of the challenges is going to be about developing legitimacy. And I think part of the way that you're going to need to do that is early on by sort of showing the independence of the body and showing what the value can be. And I think that that first value proposition can be to sort of say, what are the baselines? And this doesn't mean that I think that company policy should be homogenous, because I don't. And it doesn't mean that I think that there's no variation in how things get applied in different cultural contexts, because I don't think that either. But I do think that, as Chinmayi points out, we've committed broadly, globally, to a set of human rights standards, and we should be thinking about how those apply to form sort of the floor of how we moderate content online. And then I think once you have established sort of those functions, and you have legitimacy, and the other challenge I think is buy-in, then I think you can talk about a lot of other functions that such a body might have that could be valuable, that could add value to the space. But I agree with Chinmayi that sort of that's the starting place from my perspective.
Okay. Kit?
Yeah, so in thinking about the function of a social media council, I think about what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And we have an issue where a huge amount of speech in our society is governed in an unaccountable way by a small number of platforms. And so what does it mean that they govern it? What it means in practice is that the rules that they set out are a mishmash of influences of who has the power to influence that tech company. It's governments, it's desire for profit, it's the people who make it up, it's the employees, it's the users. And in constructing sort of another body that's going to grapple with some of the same questions, it's important to make sure that that body is going to be constituted in a way that doesn't fall prey to the same influences and result in the same bad outcomes for democracy and for equity, like we see with the tech companies making those decisions, and the many, many ways that those content moderation decisions go wrong at the expense of disempowered groups, where you can't complain about racism, you can't remix somebody's copyrighted thing if they have a deal with Google, you can't speak back when you're harassed in a way that is general, complaining about the category of people that you experience harassment from. And the sort of specific mechanics of that menu of options, I think, depends on how much effort you're willing to put into the legitimacy piece. Because you could go as far as to take on a project that is the entirety of figuring out how to govern yourselves in a democratic society, right? Like, if we want to create a legitimate body that's going to have the final say over what speech gets to get said in the world, you better have a really robust plan for legitimacy before you get anywhere near empowering a body with that kind of authority. I also think in the context of these decisions being made as the product of a whole bunch of influences of different sort of power centers in the world, in society, the idea of a social media council can work really well in concert with other approaches, like promoting competition, so that you don't have just a couple of giants making these decisions, because there shouldn't be just one rule set that governs what gets to be said in the world. And if you have competition, if you have options, that's generally good for freedom of expression. It's fewer, it's more, it doesn't have the same single point of failure issue where I can just lobby the one entity that has control of a vast amount of speech, get a bad rule, and be done. There has to be more broad base to ideas and to norms than there is when you have a sort of monoculture intellectually. So there's competition. There's thinking about who else has power over the tech companies. There are their workers. You could think about unionizing. It's going to be maybe slightly more demographically diverse than the people who hold more power at the companies. You can think about tools that put more decision-making power in the hands of the individual users. So this could be, I don't want Zuckerberg's algorithm for my newsfeed. I want Snopes.com, or I want Daphne Keller to be the one who sets those levers. And that also addresses a big swath of legitimacy concerns. There are two big categories of harms that come from speech online. One is harms that result from sort of being confronted with something that you don't want to be confronted with, or that's triggering or harmful to you directly. And then there's another important swath of harms that are more social harms, things that are toxic to democracy in a more general sense. That's the harder problem. For the stuff that is harmful when you perceive it and don't want you to, there is a person who has pretty good legitimacy in controlling what you're going to be confronted with, and that's you. And there's much more of a conversation we could have about that, but those are my thoughts for the time
Okay,
being.
well, you've taken us kind of from functions into kind of jurisdiction and constitution, which is the next area that we want to go to. And you've raised the issue of legitimacy. So one way to get legitimacy and maybe greater representativeness, or a different way of cutting at this, is not to have it be corporate or platform specific, to have the jurisdiction be some kind of political or sovereign entity, or some kind of larger social entity. So back to you, Chinmay, what are your thoughts on jurisdiction?
I think that is the interesting question of our times, right? So usually when we're looking at the international human rights norms, the thing is that they derive from the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and the ICS-ESCR, and they are covenants signed by states. But also at a time at which I don't think anyone envisaged the kind of power that companies would have. I've been reading the UN Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression, David Kaye's reports, and it's interesting because he started including now a series of recommendations for companies in addition to recommendations for states. And I think that says a lot about who has influence over here. I think the legitimacy question is important, which is why if we're saying that companies should almost be treated like states, we would need to develop a way in which we sort of define which companies and what is the point at which they should come to the table. But perhaps the other way just lies in the analogy that the social media councils derive from, which is press councils, where it was perfectly normal to have the regulated be a part of the system and to adopt the recommendations of the system, if that makes sense. So I don't think that these norms can be developed entirely in the absence of companies. But that said, I don't think that states and companies should also have the defining role here. And I think that the construction of the body and its is important in that we need to ensure that its composition keeps it true to international human rights norms, and that in the process of getting people to comply or to buy into the model, we don't compromise the norms themselves. So I think that's a long way of saying it's complicated.
Let me get a couple of other opinions here, and then I want to probe this more deeply. Go ahead, Megan.
So I think that Kit really highlighted something that's really important when we think about whether this is the model, whatever model we come up with. I think we always have to keep central who is going to be the center of power and who is going to have access to that power. And Kit highlighted lots of different ways that we might redistribute or think about ways to make that power more diversely distributed. But that's one of the reasons why I think it's important for this body, if it comes to be cross-platform. And that's because I think that I think that, and let me just say, I think that what Facebook is doing is good for Facebook. This is not meant to say platforms shouldn't have their own processes or they shouldn't have their own approaches. They absolutely should. This is to say that we need to have a space, or I believe that we need to have a space in which we have conversations that have to include the platforms, as Chinmay mentioned, of course, but also include other people and give them power to have influence over the ways in which these decisions get made.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the composition of the group and trying to make sure that it is diverse and representative is an incredible challenge that is absolutely worth investing in trying to solve. I don't know how solvable it is the more you have a global single entity instead of a more local approach to understanding the norms and cultures of value of the communities that you are moderating. So there's a huge difference between we have one global speech advisory council and what's it going to say? Is it going to flesh out international human rights principles a little more in the context of content moderation, or is it going to take up this particular example from this country and say what they think about it? Because that doesn't seem as valuable as empowering people in a community to have conversations with a moderator that they trust and they choose. I think the other half of the question about when do we hold a company to the kind of standards that we have to constrain government power is a critical one. And we can sort of think about some factors, like when it becomes big enough to have a lot of influence on our self-governance, then we should think about getting our constitutional moment when we like rein in what corporations that govern us are able to do in terms of those decisions.
Okay, I kind of anticipated that the three of you would lean more toward a broader framework for this than just platform specific. But I'd now like to extend this and pose two more specific questions, and feel free to answer either or both. And I will just preface this by saying that as a political scientist who thinks a lot about, regulatory institutions to constrain government power and enable control of corruption, abuse of power, protection of human rights, and so on, I think one of the trickiest, most tenaciously difficult questions is how you constitute these bodies, who appoints them. So my two questions, again, starting with you, Chinmay, are first of all, if we're thinking about this at the national level, and I invite you to take India as an example if you wish, how could any form of a social media council, maybe starting with the earlier one you imagine, be appointed that would not be captured by the state or the corporations? And secondly, if you wish to do so, because I don't know that there's anyone in this room from Facebook now, but I'm willing to bet that anything that is said here will potentially, be absorbed by Facebook in some way. They've made it clear they're moving ahead with this, right? They're going to have, I think Mark Zuckerberg said, by the fall, a kind of internal corporate advisory body that will have at least some of the functions we've been talking about. So if you were talking to Facebook or another such internet platform, how would you advise them to constitute and appoint this body so that it will not be and will not be perceived to be simply a captive of, and ultimately faithful to the company? So first to you.
I'm going to digress slightly.
Okay.
And So I think my reservation about the Facebook model, admirable as it is that it's never going to question implementation of local laws. And so Facebook has been very clear that this is about terms and conditions. And
Okay.
if a government should ask Facebook to take down content that anyone would argue is a violation of the human rights standards, then Facebook would comply. And so I feel like that is actually the space for the social media councils, because the social media councils have, as far as I can read right now, undertaken the task of getting into government, into local laws that might violate international human rights. That said, I think that what you ask is an interesting question, from the point of view of both councils. Again, if I can zoom out of this a little, one thing I want to say is that I like that the new conception of the social media councils contemplates both a global council and national councils. The global council would be necessary so that there's a degree of coordination and baseline norm setting. And the local council, as you say, would be necessary to get context. I think that Kit has highlighted beautifully the many reasons why we might want to do that. In the last discussion, I can violate Chatham House rules since I was the one that did it. I was the one that raised questions of what happened, what happens in authoritarian countries where there's a national council, but the people questioning government laws are at risk if they go too far in questioning it. I think I would do a disservice to all the people in India speaking out if I were to suggest that is the case right now in India. But I can say that the freedom with which we spoke in the past is constrained somewhat. Activists have been arrested recently, and so I think it's a valid question. I think there are two ways of looking at it. That countries reach a point where there is a danger of government capture of a council like this. And that would be unfortunate, because then you would have a social media council essentially legitimating government action when it shouldn't, and basically undercutting the very function that it's supposed to perform. But there was another person at the consultation whose anonymity I will not violate, who pointed out that within the same countries, there are people who are speaking up and who are speaking for human rights. So again, I think that much is going to lie in how we select people, both for diversity and for their true adherence to international human rights norms. I don't think I have a magic formula for it, but I can give you an example of there's a prominent activist in Turkey, which we know is an atmosphere in which people are having difficulty speaking out. He's credible, he's an excellent academic, and he has had a history of questioning the government's repressive policies. I think that the construction of the council would have to be such that we have the courage to put him on it and to hear from him, even at the expense of what Turkey might think. And perhaps we'll have to come up with procedures so that is possible, both in the interest of protecting him and protecting the council's decisions. But I do want to point out that these people exist.
Yeah. Let me just say that my nervousness about national level councils is that if you have the government appointing them merely, as the ultimate authority with the only obligation to quote, and in very thick quotation marks, consult civil society, it's just hard to imagine real autonomy from all of the issues and constraints you're talking about. And I will underscore, this was one of the most vigorous points of debate in our February meeting. But anyway, to be a little unpredictable, let's go to you next, Kit, and see how you reply to either or both of these questions.
Yeah, I think having this convening led by the company that it's supposed to constrain is a very difficult position for having something effective in the end. I think you could envision a whole bunch of civil society groups coming together and fleshing out, this is what platforms, ought to be doing. Not this is the one way to do it, but if you stray into this bad zone, we're going to slap you for it. Here, this is going to have these negative effects. Not with the platform's money, not with the platform's blessing or guidance or nominations, not with the government's consultation, but doing it in a way that doesn't originate with the interests that are causing the problems.
Megan?
That's a really interesting point, because I think that in substance I agree with you, but I wonder in practice how you fully exclude the platforms from the process. And I don't know the answer to my own question here, which is whether there's a way to try to set up a structure where the platforms have a voice, but they're not the dominant voice and they don't have the control over the whole structure. And I say that in part because to some extent, they have knowledge that is important in designing these kinds of systems. And so I agree with you completely in the foundations of what you're saying. And I've spent a lot of time thinking and don't know that I have quite the right answer about how you build that structure, you know what I mean? I think I will take a quick step back and just sort of say, as we think about this, and then I'm interested to hear whether you have ideas about that, but I just want to sort of say, big picture, I think it goes back to what Kit said initially, and then maybe also Chinmay, you mentioned this, which is, like, what do we want this to do? What problem do we want it to solve? And I would encourage us to view it as a part of an ecosystem. Somebody else used that word, and I apologize, I can't remember which of the two of you it was, but to view this not as a single solution to a single problem, but as a component of an ecosystem that helps to solve a range of problems. And I think that that as we can get really into the weeds about the things that can't be solved by this system, and I don't think we're there yet. I'm just saying, like, I often get very into the weeds and become a little discouraged. And I think that's why it's important to sort of see there's going to be a range of solutions. It's going to involve probably lots of different types of approaches. Kit outlined some very interesting, both sort of personal strategies and some strategies that platforms could employ earlier in shifting that. And so I just wonder how we, in the context of this body, can think about ensuring that we provide sufficient power to the voices that aren't currently being heard but that are important, while not losing out on both the information that we get from some of the voices that currently do have power, and also, I mean, for better or worse, the need to have those people be a little bit bought in order for the body to be effective. So, I mean, is it okay, Larry, for me to ask Kit what her thoughts on that
Absolutely.
are? Or
Yeah.
Chinmay, but since I'm responding to your comment.
Sure, a few different things. So I think from a starting point, getting transparency into what the real rules are would be really helpful for talking about them. We have sort of the published community standards, and then there's the big handbook that goes to the content moderators where the secret real rules are. And it is hard to talk about those without having access to them. In terms of participation, I think it's important to separate out the ultimate authority from the profit motive or the narrow interest, less than preventing a dialogue or participation. But the body, the report talks a lot about different ways of trying to protect the body from influences that would undermine its legitimacy. And that's the main thing that I'm trying to get at in terms of positioning the body as an organic product of civil society and public interest advocates, as opposed to something that is shepherded by the entities to be governed or influenced.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I agree. And I actually think that there's something to learn from Facebook's oversight board, because as I understand it, the argument side, I think of this as a lawyer, like two sides arguing a case, common law system. They seem to be edging towards a system in which a case will be made and explanations will be provided for why decisions were made the way they were. And I feel like that might address your concerns. And so perhaps one way of thinking of the rules of the company, to answer your question, Larry, is almost not in an adjudicatory role, but very much in an explanatory, how did this happen? Can we understand this better role?
Well, I want to protect my legitimacy now by consulting the multiple stakeholders in the room here who are the, survivors of this, extended day. So we have a mic floating around somewhere. We have a hand up. We're all teed up.
Hi, my name is Valerie, and I'm a student researcher here at Stanford, and I have a couple of questions for you guys. So the first is fact checking different from content moderation? And if so, do you think that the Social Media Council body could provide some standards on fact checking? And my second question being, even credible organizations like the WTO have seen their systems and regulations be circumvented by participating actors, most notably by our own president. Is that something that you're concerned the social media councils will face a problem with?
Okay, let's start with the first question on fact-checking versus content moderation. Anyone want to?
Sure.
Go ahead, Kit.
So I think fact check, a lot of the discussion of social media councils uses, I think for convenience, this binary of does the content stay up or get taken down? And in fact, there are a bunch of other tools like fact checking, contextualization, content warnings, up-ranking, down-ranking, which the social media council should consider. I think it would be a loss to only think in the binary. But also the question of sort of putting up context next to something involves the same legitimacy concern, right? Like, I don't necessarily want all of my news to be annotated by Facebook's viewpoint, but if I could designate that, you know, I'm going to get Snopes annotations or something else that I would like to see, and everyone has the option of deciding who to trust instead of the few big platforms being the only games in town, that would be beneficial. I don't know. We sort of have set a tall order for the Social Media Council, particularly when they're going to grapple with particular cases. Like in this model, there is a lot of content that happens on the internet. And also, if only sort of the hard cases go to the Social Media Council, it's likely that there's going to be disagreement then among experts. If it's a hard case, then people are more likely to disagree. So I don't know that I think that is an important function in increasing the diversity of sources for commentary and fact-checking, so that it's not just the platforms is the priority that I would emphasize.
I'll just really quickly add that I think that when we think about fact checking, we're very often thinking about whether something's true or not. When we think about content moderation, sometimes that's what we care about, but other times we care about what the impact of the content is. Is it inciting violence? You could imagine a statement that was entirely factual in that it was informing people that they should go out and hurt people. That's not untrue. It doesn't need to be fact checked. It just is an incitement to violence, right? So I would say that I agree completely with what you said about contextualizing fact checking, but also I think that we should remember that sometimes the things that we're thinking about are not only true and false. That's not the only binary that we're thinking about there.
Agree completely with both, as I expected. But I think you're thinking of the Nancy Pelosi video, perhaps, where Facebook had indicated that it's not an accurate representation of what happened, but it
The
was
distortion of her speech by...
Yes, of the slowed down video. I think Facebook was under some fire because it indicated that this is a distortion but didn't take it down. And there were people that argued that it should. I think if you were to look at this from a Freedom of Expression and Social Media Council's point of view, one might argue that that fact-checking is a part of the spectrum of ways in which speech can be moderated or regulated. And therefore, it should be held up to a standard along with the other ways that Megan described in which speech is regulated. So it would be a shame, in other words, to only look at taking down of content, because now there are other ways in which freedom of expression can be affected.
Okay, well, the mic is traveling to Nate personally. Where is the mic? I'll just say in response to your other question, what are you going to do? I mean, the U.S. could pull out, I think maybe has under Trump, of the UN Human Rights Council. I mean, any actor can always withdraw from any multilateral body. And I think what you can do, if you're going to have a global social media council, is, not base it on governments, and therefore, a government can't simply withdraw.
So one thing we did at the law school this year is we taught a policy lab on the Facebook Council that Megan was nice enough to talk to our students. We're going to have a report that comes out in the next few weeks on this, and we worked with Facebook with the council. One thing that's come up in all these discussions is that it gets very, and Kit, you sort of mentioned this, which is that once you start thinking about cases, like real concrete situations, it starts getting very difficult to figure out what this outside counsel is going to do and what they're going to base their decisions on. And so a lot of the talk here is about, say, dealing with, say, international human rights law as the baseline for what the companies should do. So let me just ask, like, just to get really concrete, you take the three most recent, big controversies: the Nancy Pelosi video, the Christchurch shooting, and then let's say Holocaust denial, as Zuckerberg and Twitter, YouTube takes a different position than Facebook does. How should a council deal, say, with those three settings, applying international human rights law to decide whether that stuff should be taken down or not, and whether one company is right to do so and another isn't? I mean, it seems to me that international human rights law actually doesn't have an answer to that kind of question. But if they're going to have to base their decisions on something, and so what should it be?
Why don't you start, Chinmay?
I have a slightly long answer.
Well, we have slightly few minutes. So
Well, I wanted to bring this up actually during the conversation. I would add a fourth to yours, which is at the IGF in Switzerland, I actually discussed the question of hard cases in social media companies, because I was working on hate speech at the time. And the one that I was thinking of was actually Kashmir in India, which is when the Indian government says that it is concerned about terrorist content in Kashmir, it is not wrong. Terrorist content is of concern, but there's also a major freedom struggle and an extensive violation of people's human rights. And so when a platform is confronted with the photograph of someone that the Indian government calls a terrorist and the Kashmiri people call a freedom fighter, what does the platform do, right? And this is Burhan Wani, if anyone wants to look it up. That is precisely the reason that I think that the Social Media Council is valuable, because the hard questions are where we need the international human rights, and we need to consider the exceptions to the human rights and draw lines over time where we indicate how a platform is supposed to respond when it's shown something that it's told is terrorist content but might not be. Because I think that failing that, what happens is that the platforms have to believe governments and what they're told, and that way lies excessive censorship, especially of vulnerable people's rights.
And I would, if I can, you go ahead, Kit,
and then
please.
we'll come to Kit.
If I can just sort of add to that, I would say, and then I'm interested, I'm one of the non-lawyers up here. So I will just say, my view is not that how the Social Media Council should work is that they see one of these hard cases and they say, okay, what does international human rights law say about it? And then that's the end of the story. My view is that the Social Media Council should be taking international human rights laws and norms, the international human rights frameworks, and part of their role should be thinking about how we take those principles and we translate them into practical standards that then develop, as Chinmay has mentioned, over time into rules and to suggestions about how we handle complicated cases. It's not that we stop at this is the law and we just apply it. It's that we say, this is the framework that we have that we've all agreed on. Here we are in this new context. How are we going to think about what the standards are that emerge from that in relation to this new context? And then as hard cases come up, okay, here's a hard case. Here's what we've done so far. Here's what we've thought about so far. And now how are we going to tackle this hard problem?
I think you're exactly right. And it's really important to recognize that existing international human rights law does not answer these questions. It is not written at a granular level that will let you interpret it to make these judgments. And you need to recognize that so that it's not a talisman to sort of waft away the hard problems of what are the answers going to be and who's going to decide them. To further complicate it, context is so important. It's not as if the video of the Christchurch shooting should be obliterated from the world and never studied by people who are responding to school shootings or want to understand the motivations of people who engage in violence. So the idea that it just, on our online platform, it just cannot exist, even to people who want to discuss it for that purpose, or even when it's preceded by a warning about what's in it, is understandably overlooked, I think. We heard earlier that no one would advocate that the Christchurch video should be allowed on Facebook. Well, I'm gonna advocate for that, not because it's valuable to glorify violence or Islamophobia, but because it's valuable to be able to study those things and talk about what happens in the world. And if you can't do that on one of the most central, influential platforms for speech, that actually does have a cost. And when the Social Media Council takes up a case study, I hope that the people who are making those judgments are going to approach it in a way that is context sensitive. But I think it's difficult to imagine all of the contexts that you are not presented with, particularly if you are seeing something reprehensible in a terrible context. It's very easy not to understand why there could be value to talking about, criticizing, and understanding that content.
Okay, I think we have time for, is that Yeva, is that you in the corner there? Yeva Elvis, if you can be brief, we'll keep the responses brief.
Good afternoon, Eva Elvis. I'm from Europe, I'm from Latvia, and I'm sorry if I will maybe bring a bit different perspective.
Oh, please.
But an observation for me here, and I've been commuting, especially last half a year, very often to Europe, back and forth. And what strikes me is that Europe is actually, European Union in particular, is raising the same questions and taking different steps, be it regulations on the EU level, be it Germany, be it Spanish, be it debate in UK. And when I come here, and I do it now this very often, I rarely hear any reference when we discuss the global solutions, what we think of EU doing. And when I go to EU and sit in those brainstormings, I very rarely hear what people, besides, when you speak about Zuckerberg or, companies, but academia or debate in US, and it kind of feels like it's a parallel, separate world, while still kind of addressing the same topics. You hear more China as a global partner or adversaries and actually EU role in this sort of debate. And so since you talk about the Global Council and sort of discussing, I was just wondering, you on a panel, what you think, have you been looking how EU deals with it? Does it bounce back here? Does it resonate? Does it do any good or on contrary? Because the EU has taken a number of steps like voluntarily engaging social networks. They have created this ethical behavior platform and they pick up regulations. They have a copyright directive and multiple other things. So I was just wondering whether there is some sort of opinion on how it looks, how EU action and thinking looks here. Thank you.
I can't speak for Nate Persily and Dan Bonnet, but I think I know Nate Persily's thinking enough to know that how the EU is approaching this and just generally engaging Europe is going to be a very important priority.
I'll be in Brussels in 2 weeks.
And GDPI, has made a bit of a, effort to try and understand and engage the AU. We've had Maricha Schaake, who's been an important voice for from the parliamentary side of the EU, and very thoughtful one on these issues at a couple of our meetings. We've met with German parliamentarians who, have defended their law. We've been trying to wrestle with and learn from the GDPR. It's going to be a continuing priority, but any concluding thoughts that any of you have, because our panel's about to end, either in response to this or anything else? Chinmayi?
I think generally I would say that the global and local are not mutually exclusive. And the other thing to bear in mind is that people worry that a global media, social media council would lose the local flavor. I think that that's a misreading of what countries have to offer. It is possible to find expertise from all around the world so that the council is representative, but has a sense of what's going on around the world, although of course every group won't be represented. So that's my parting thought.
I'll very briefly respond to this question about Europe, since before I came to GDPI, I spent most of my time thinking about post-communist Europe and Europe generally. first of all, I would say that I think we do think about Europe a lot in the context of this. We had several European representatives at the meeting in February, and I think that NetzDG in Germany has sort of set the path for a lot of the way that content moderation laws are being written around the world. When you talk about how Europe approaches these questions, I have like very different views about the different ways that they've approached it. I think they've done some really good things. I think that NetzDG and laws like it are a little bit more problematic because I think that they have a tendency to incentivize censorship on the part of the platforms, right? It's not
And authoritarian countries.
Yes, exactly. I do have an issue with this idea that you need to remove things in this very quick time frame, and that what you need to remove isn't necessarily very clearly defined, because that's going to tend to mean that platforms are going to overcorrect. They're going to take down anything that could potentially result in them being fined. And I think that that's a problem. I think it's always important in these conversations to remember that Europe and the United States, we both believe in free expression, but we believe that that means something pretty different, right? There's lots of things that are legal to restrict in many European countries and not legal to restrict in the United States, and we should stay grounded in that. So that's sort of my general response to that. And just to close, I'll just say that we really welcome feedback on this, and we'd love to hear more. I hope you got a copy of the report. There are some additional copies out there, and we'd love to hear from you. My parting thought is the reason that I think that this is important is not because, as I said, I think it solves all problems, but because I do think that we need something that comes from outside of the platforms, that involves a diversity of voices, and that creates a structure for us to have conversations around these very, very hard questions that are neither centered in government power nor centered only in platform power, but bring together a range of different stakeholders in order to come up with solutions.
Great. Kent?
I would echo what Megan just said about Europe, and move on to sort of a parting thought, which is that the Social Media Council can be a really valuable tool for focusing the power of the public, or it could be something that legitimates a broken system and distracts advocates and doesn't achieve anything useful. And I think composing the effort and placing it in a constellation of efforts that are designed to exercise the power of the people impacted by these platforms for the benefit of those people, to improve the outcomes of the content moderation decisions for democracy and for equity, there is a role for a group of public-minded experts to engage in something that is a social media council very carefully. I appreciate all of the thought that is going into trying to approach it in the right way.
I would even say there is a role for public-minded experts like the three of you. In any case, we want to transition expeditiously now to the final panel of the day. I ask you to join me in thanking our three panelists, and especially Chinmay, who flew out from Boston for this session. Thank you very much.